one of the things that might be. I mean, I was thinking today, like why am I talking or whatever? What do I have to even offer? But what, just kind of experience of things that I've seen and things that I think that maybe work, things that maybe I think don't work so well, and hopefully that might be of some use or benefit to somebody. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know.
I think that's why we're all here.
When that moment came, a lot of people get that kind of awakening glimpse, and then it dissipates. Well, can you give any advice on how to maintain it?
Yeah, well, here we'll talk. I'll definitely go into this whole thing because I think I'll probably end up once we get started here. But well, anyway, but talk a little bit about what I even think this stuff is and stuff, and I don't really think there is a moment. It's not really what this is. I mean, I spent 20 or 25 years pursuing enlightenment, the great moment, and only to come to find out that it was a misguided assumption that wasn't really what this was. And I'll say that's I mean part of I got to be I think all I can be is true to my experience or to share kind of my perspective, but also part of what I do is do a little bit of maybe countering some myths about what this is. I mean, there's very little non-duality available in the United States. There's very few people speaking about non-duality. Very few.
Real non-duality.
As I would define it, and I'll talk about that. So there's a lot in spirituality that's going on that could be useful to examine, to kind of challenge some of the mythology of it. I think the biggest one out there is awakening. Like something happens to you and then you're there and then you've got it and then you go to these meetings and there's somebody that has it or something like that. But that's not the way that I view it, because I don't have anything. And I've never had any awakening or liberation or anything. And I don't think it was never even part of non-duality. It was completely, it's the way the mind interprets everything. It says, well, these people, they must have had some incredible thing. But that's not actually what they said, which is interesting. Go back and read, actually, I mean, we were talking earlier today about a lot of people are into Advaita or satsang, but not often haven't actually read or been that acquainted with the tradition, or actually read Ramana, or read very seriously, sat down and really deeply considered what these people were saying. So and I think that's a problem, if we haven't had some acquaintance with the basic context of what these traditions have been saying, because the non-duality traditions have been around for thousands of years, India and China and everywhere. And they're essentially saying a very similar, very, very simple message. But a lot of us as seekers are not even acquainted with what that message is. So we're going around doing spirituality in the popular kind of arenas with all these assumptions as to what it is. And again, it's my perspective, my kind of view on it. But it could be helpful to maybe talk about some of those things too. Some of the things that maybe this is not what people think it is. And it may be like my search for enlightenment for 25 years. I wish I would have known in the beginning that wasn't what this was.
Nobody told you.
Nobody told me. But so, and we'll talk about, and the basics the basics of non-duality. Well, I guess I'll save it until the official beginning. So. But it's like a couple, maybe two or three basic ideas. Like I had some people come to this talk. Had notebooks ready to write and everything, and they're gonna. I said, this is too simple. There's nothing to write down. They had gone to this other group where they were lecturing. It was like a 12-day seminar, and you had to take notes, and you had to sit for 6 hours a day, and they paid thousands of dollars, and they were just. It's funny because I have this little. I have a little talk that I do in this yoga studio, and we just put up some chairs in a circle. And we just talk, and it's nothing to really write down. But anyway, these people came from this other group, a whole busload of them, So they kind of showed up early to the meeting before I was there, and they set up the room. So I kind of came in, and there was like this, my chair was like up front, and then there were like all these rows, like a college class. I said, well, wait a minute, what's this about? They had their little notebooks all ready to go. And I said, what are you doing?
They're seeking.
We're used to going to college classes. I mean, it's a reasonable kind of assumption. Good they didn't put up a big thing.
Well, and the assumption going on there is that there's this body of information that you want to collect, and you're going to write it all down, and then that's what it is. And we had a nice discussion about that wasn't what it was about. That non-duality is not pointing to information, and and they were actually diligent students of I think it was Nisargadatta or something like that. They were collecting his words in his books and recording and transcribing and learning it and memorizing it. And I told him a very simple thing that somebody told me that he said right before he died. He said, "Forget me and forget my teachings." That was his last will and testament. Forget everything that I said. And he said, and that was curious to me. You have to kind of think about why he said that, because I think he knew that if people just basically memorized all the recorded words, that they wouldn't even have what he was. They wouldn't. They would miss everything that he was trying to say. And we can talk about the difference between knowledge and concepts and teachings versus what this is really about. Because it's actually not about teachings either. Like Ramana Maharshi didn't have any teaching. It seemed like he did, because people would write down words and then they were saying, well, somehow that's a teaching. But if you really stop and think about what he was doing, like what he was functioning as, or what like that, you realize that he actually didn't have any teaching at all. Little insights like that were helpful, because I spent many years studying those things, studying the books and all that, and it wasn't that helpful. I became like a Ramana expert. But and I even went so far as to start learning Tamil, which was his language, because I thought, well, because it was funny, because I was reading all of his books and I wasn't finding any happiness, and so my mind said, well, I guess it's because I don't know Tamil. Because there's probably a mistranslation issue, and if I could only read his original words. And I went to India one time in the 90s, and I was collecting, he had this really, one of his students was really a poet, and sat there with Ramana for decades and wrote everything in Tamil and in verses and all that, really incredible stuff apparently. And I thought, if I could only read that, that would be the answer. So I was over there, and I was collecting all these Tamil books and everything, and making photocopies down at the Xerox place, and coming back to America with like trunk loads of Tamil texts, thinking, this is the treasure, I've got it now. Of course, I couldn't read any of it. I used to just look at the books and the answer's in here, I just can't read it. Feel it, smell it, look at it. And then I thought, well, if I could just learn Tamil. So for a couple of years I was trying. A very difficult language in some ways. And I actually, eventually, somewhere along there, it dawned on me that the whole endeavor was completely misguided anyway, because there's nowhere that Ramana ever said once in his entire life to learn Tamil. Or that if you learned it, that you would somehow be closer or anything like that. So I thought, well, why am I doing all this? Because I respected his teaching and all that stuff. And I thought, well, he never actually encouraged anybody to learn Tamil and study his works. So I kind of gave it up at that point. So it's funny things. The things that we do. At least I did. I'm sure others do. Like from that position of seeking. So
many detours.
Yeah, and I think that if there's one thing I might be able to do, at least offer some tips, or at least my experience on things, kind of like not mistakes really, but just kind of things that didn't work, or things that I felt would work better. and at least for me, and then maybe that would resonate, or you may find it useful or not. But and then meeting Sailor Bob eventually got me to that point, not because I had an awakening, but it did get me to a point where I really wasn't feeling I was seeking anymore. Wasn't suffering anymore. And but I don't attribute that to an awakening, because it really wasn't like, suddenly I'm there. It was nothing like that. Because everybody in this room can come to a spot just by looking at what we're talking about, where they're not seeking and suffering and have any doubt about any of this stuff, what Raman is teaching, what some of these non-dual things. I mean, what's the essential message? I hope that we can all, even in a meeting like this, basically get the sense of it, get the essence of it. To hopefully be able to walk away from a meeting, say, oh, I can see what they're talking about, and also in your experience, in my experience, I can actually see and recognize what is being pointed to. So that's the whole goal of it. So you kind of walk away. I think if we do this right, and if we keep it simple, you walk away knowing or recognizing that within yourself, and then you don't need me or anybody. And that's, I guess, maybe if I could try, somehow, hopefully, try to communicate how that is, or why that is, or something like that. Let me do my best to try to share that. So anyway, we haven't started yet. We're almost done. Time to go.
Can everybody hear? I just want to check whether we need them to be mic'd,
Hi.
whether John needs to be mic'd. Or can everybody hear?
It's kind of a wide audience, so forgive me if I got to make sure that I kind of turn and go like this. But
Because we could mic you a little bit,
it's up to you guys. Whatever you guys want is fine. I don't have a preference on it, but
So let's leave it simply at hi, I'm stream. If we need amplification, if you can't hear, just say so, and we can turn on, and there are speakers in the corners.
yeah, let me know.
So just let us know.
Is this being recorded?
I don't know, not really, no. But I think
It's not being recorded.
Would you object if I brought in a recorder? Would it be okay?
if you just sit over
I
there.
mean, I'll give it to you.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer. I guess I'm not really. I'm not so much into it. I think that it's, again. We'll talk about that too. That what I can say and what can be recorded about this is kind of like the husk of it anyway. It's not that critical. So I'm not a big fan of necessarily, preserving all that stuff. But
Is it okay for the spiders to hang out in front of you there? Or?
Yeah. Yeah, where's he attached to?
This has got nothing to worry about. That was good eye.
Yeah, wow. You got the discriminating vision, huh?
Well, she told me this morning the men are essentially visual, so it's a living manifestation of it.
And also, I mean, if there's anything that I was thinking, if there's anything that you folks want to talk about, or want me to talk about, or that you feel that you'd like to get out of a meeting like this, don't hesitate. I mean, I usually, try to say a few things just to get the ball rolling. But, if there's any burning issues or topics, I mean, I was kind of thinking about it today, like, well, what can I say that I can talk about, like my background and things that I've done over years and what I think the essence of it is. Do that. Also talk about what I think non-duality actually is. I did have some acquaintance with Ramana and with Nisargadatta and some of that. If people, I mean, there were many years for me where it's like I was kind of in doubt as to what they even were saying. Like, what is Ramana's, like, what's his message? Or something like that. And it took me a long time to kind of even get a handle on that, you know. So there's that kind of topic, and then there's questions or experiences, or maybe you understand this stuff already. There are people in this room that definitely understand this already, and I guess they're just here to say hi. And those people also I invite to feel free to contribute and share. Like I do my meeting in Santa Cruz, and there are many people that come that totally understand this. And one of the values is that they other people there can actually hear other perspectives, and it's very, very helpful because it's not. I'm very much my model or my idea of this is many people seeing it and being able to share and stand on their own, not like a top-down kind of a thing. Because you'll see the message is not really about a somebody who has anything, and that we as seekers, you know, kind of are perpetually following somebody. That's not my vision of what this is at all. It's actually something quite simple and quite available to anybody who wants to look at it. And then you can share it. And I hope people that that do see this and understand this, you know, or feel comfortable sharing it and pointing it out with their friends back in your own communities. Why not? That's actually what I see is more, I think, how this really works, you know. There's no reason why anybody in this room cannot see this and understand it and be fully confident in that, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, even today, even in a meeting like this. And so that's another topic. Another thing, if there are people here that understand or have experience that want to share, definitely don't hesitate. The other angle was maybe some, you know, like I was saying before, some myth busting. And I don't want to mention names or teachers specifically because socially it's awkward and it doesn't really accomplish that much. But basically, you know, notions, like prevailing notions of spirituality or things that people might be doing or saying about this stuff, to maybe have some frank, open discussion in a healthy way, kind of just to look at some of these things to see, well, wait a minute, what's really true about this stuff? Because some of the things that I came to know later, that if I would have known 20 or 30 years before, would have saved me a lot of time and expense and year soul searching, you know, and trying to figure things out that I just simply wasn't aware of. And so there is a value of that. I mean, there is a place in this kind of discussion where you can. I think that's a potentially valuable topic. And maybe you guys have some other things, questions, experiences, and then, you know, maybe getting some feedback, from me and or from anybody else that feels like they could say something, because I don't know, you know, I haven't experienced everything or understand. I haven't done every technique and every approach and everything. I mean, there are things in spirituality, topics or techniques or meditations that I just simply have never experienced. You know, I think we all kind of stumble into certain things that, you know, kind of a certain alignment with certain things that we find, and I may or may not have experience with any of that. But somebody else may. Like if somebody wanted to say they're doing the mantra practice, well, I've never done that. So I don't know. So anyway, so are we started yet? And then I also have I do, for some reason I do music, and I have done some songs and things over the years along these lines that maybe give a taste of that. So I've got Stream provided this, and I've got my lyrics here, and which I never remember them, so I do have to look. But I apologize for that. But anyway, I do have some songs that are, you know, non-duality, and some things that I've written, and also you know, I think some quotes from Ramana, and some Zen things, Kabir, Meister Eckhart, Shankara, some Tao Te Ching. You know, just a variety of pointers, and sometimes people enjoy the musical presentation. So let's see. So so we can stop and do some of that if you'd like. And if anybody needs to take a break, or it's getting too rambling, and it's just you feel like you want to stop or whatever. Or you need to get up in the middle of the meeting if you have to go use the restroom or something like that. Don't hesitate. Or if you don't like the meeting, or it's just not your thing, or I'm boring or something, I mean, don't hesitate. You can.
Or to get enlightened in the middle of the talk.
Yeah.
You don't need any more, just that's we're finished.
Exactly. Yeah. If you get it so-called enlightened, but there's no need. Why stay? I actually had some guy that came to my meeting one time, and he came and he said, "I've been into Vedanta for 30 years. I know everything. I've read everything. I've studied everything. I don't need any more knowledge." He said, I'm kind of, this is like one little, I just seem to be missing one little point, one little something. He says, it's like I know everything about it, I just don't know what it is. And I was kind of sharing in the way that I do, and pointing out to something in our experience, and it went in for about 5 minutes. And he said, "Oh, that." And he kind of looked like this. He looked around a little bit and he said, "Oh, okay, now I get it." I thought, well, that's interesting. And but then he just stood up and he said, "I don't have any reason to be here anymore." So he shook my hand and he left. And it's like, the rest of the people were still settling in their seats. Like, where is he going? Well, I guess he got it already. And then he wrote on some website somewhere. He says, "I understand it. I don't have any questions, and I've never heard from him since." So that's what this it really is why I really think that kind of the dragging it on for years and years kind of progressive thing is not really what this is. I mean, Ramana, after all, saw this in 15 minutes, and he didn't even know what he was doing or didn't have any teaching at all. So it seemed like if we have had all this 50 years of teaching and all the direct pointing and all, we studied it all, we should be able to improve on the 15 minutes. Well, let me just say a couple of. Does anybody want to? Is there anything else that you'd like to get out of the meeting, or any topics that I've missed that would make this worthwhile? Like why are you here, and what you hope to get out of it? Does anybody want to say anything so we keep on track? Yeah.
I don't plan on leaving.
Yeah.
And I would like to know what you said that man got it. You don't have to do it right this minute.
Yeah, no, I'll do. Well, okay. I'll do. I'll start off with the basics. So I like to spend the first 1 or 2 minutes to basically cover everything, and then then you can either go, or we can say, well, because the basics of this is actually quite simple. Non-duality is actually quite simple, but. And so kind of what happens after we talk about pointed out is a lot. All we can really do after that is kind of, what about this? What about that? Yeah, but this. Yeah, but that. But it's not the actual essence of what this is. At least, and I try to make it very, very clear is. What we talk about in the beginning, in the simple part, is every question and answer and problem gets related back again to that, to see that question in the light of the basic position. So my spiel on non-duality, and I consider non-duality the core religion, like the core spirituality of all the traditions, whether it's Buddhism, Vedanta, Hinduism, Christianity, Taoism, Zen. To me, in my years, and people may challenge this, but my opinion, my kind of considered opinion is they're all basically saying the same thing, and it's culturally kind of different based on the language and the history of it and all that. But so part of what I'm trying to do, or kind of what I think is important for us, is to get it out of the cultural and kind of religious trappings and just boil it down to plain English. So I just to call it something, I tend to call it non-duality being kind of the essential message. And I think I got it kind of down to a couple of key points. But every sage, every tradition, every path is talking about a reality of some sort, truth, something, and they call it all these things. God or spirit or consciousness or whatever they call it. The thing that's actually quite interesting is it doesn't matter what they call it, because everybody's got a different name, so it's like all the names kind of cancel out. But the basic idea is there is something real, or some value, some ultimate value. All these people have said they've discovered some, ultimate value, some core truth that is of deep meaning and worth knowing. And they give us these hints that somehow in doing that we find we find an end to this sense of seeking and suffering and all that. So to me, that's the main point. Now, if it just remains as that, it's kind of, well, that's interesting, because all these ideas would come up naturally. Well, where is it, and how do I get to it, and what do I do, and when am I going to arrive at it, and all this stuff. And then we would be basically kind of still searching. Just that knowledge, just that comment that there is a reality, and it's the ultimate value, and it's worth experiencing that. Just on its own, to me, it would still leave you kind of hanging, because you'd be thinking. That's where I was for many, many years, because I thought, well, there's this great thing that I need to find out, but how? And then I was reading all these spiritual texts and things, basically to try to figure out how. It's like, what am I supposed to do? So I was reading, all these different Advaita texts and books and things, and essentially I was looking at them, looking for how do I experience that? What's the technique? What did they know? How can I kind of do that myself? So searching through all these things. So there's more to it than that. The other point, which I find is really the most stunning and is interesting, is, and what makes it non-duality, is that this reality and you are the same. That you are that. That's the culmination, at least on the Hindu side. Their whole 15,000 years of spiritual exploration comes down to one statement: you are that. Everybody's heard that, and I read that. I knew that for decades as a concept. But that is what they say, and all the traditions say that. Zen says, your own mind, your own true nature is the Buddha. Hinduism says that reality, that thou art that, and even Christianity is saying, Jesus was saying, is he and the Father, he found, or his perspective was that he and the Father were one. It sounds pretty reminiscent of the same basic idea. So to me, that's the second key point, is that whatever this reality is, you actually are that. And to me, that's actually kind of mind-blowing if you really stop and think about that. Everybody's searching for a reality, and everybody's studying religion, and yet they're trying to tell us that whatever we're looking for is actually what we are. And what I like to stress about that, and I'll kind of go over it probably again and again here, it's not you will become that, and it's not you will awaken to that, and it's not that you will purify and get there. There's nothing like that in that sentence. You are that, period. And what we're going to really do, and I think there's it's important to stress that and come back to that again and again and again as to the implications of what that really means. Because when I was searching for enlightenment for 25 years, I was not in alignment with that statement. I was thinking, oh, that's a great piece of information, but I didn't even know what to do with it. I didn't understand. I didn't really stop and really think about it. What does it mean that I am that? I just thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Now I want to get enlightened. Now I want to get it. I want to do what Ramana did. I want to do what somebody else did. I want to have the experience. And what I found, what I find, in my perspective, is that everything that I did in that mindset was in contradiction to the point. And I only came to see that 25, 30 years later, that all that stuff that I did was missing the point and misunderstanding the meaning of what that statement means. So I want to keep it always very close to that point about you are that. So this notion that whatever it is that we're seeking is already what we are. We'll talk about that. It means it has a lot of implication on seeking, on practicing, on things like enlightenment, on things like teachers, on things like students, on a lot of the stuff, on things like studying spirituality. All these things, when you take all those different topics and you start to examine them in the light of the basic pointer of that you actually are that, it puts a whole new spin on everything. So we'll talk, and it's important to see that because, it's kind of like people are usually on some kind of a path, But if you are that, where's the path? I mean, how far do you go? That kind of thing. So the third thing of it that made it, when I met Sailor Bob, the little piece that he kind of was able to help with that was a key thing was something self-evident that follows along, and that is that whatever you are is already here. It's a real simple point. Because it's easy to hear, I am that or you are that as an interesting piece of spiritual knowledge or something like that. But it can remain like a little bit conceptual, like something like, well, that's really great, but then the mind is saying like, well, how do I get there? Or what do I need to do? So he underscored something that was pointed out to him by, his teacher, but basically that your nature, whatever that is already present by definition. So that part of this is here in this room, and it's you. And everybody knows, without any doubt, has a clear sense of their own being, if you want to say it that way. And what we may not have done or put the pieces together is, like right now as you sit here with a clear, certain, and doubtless knowledge of the fact of your being, if you want to say it that way, that you and everybody here in this room is doing that, can do that, and has no difficulty knowing that they're present. That what we recognize is exactly it, and is what they're talking about. And that's how close it is, and that's how simple it is. And, that's why Nisargadatta was used to say, and I don't teach in his same style, and it was cultural and all that, but essentially one of the things he often said was, come back to the sense of I am. And Ramana used to say, reality is the simple sense of being. He'd say very simple things like, it's just the simple sense of being. Or, sometimes people would say, well, what do I do or something? He said, just be what you are. So this was so in our experience, if this non-dual kind of thread of pointing about this reality that you are that, and then you stop and start to actually come alive to this kind of taking it out of the theory into this kind of considering that our actual being is literally that, even in this moment, and then you're actually looking at, you have you're actually recognizing and looking at and seeing what they're talking about. So that's the third part of that, is that your literal being and presence that is already here beyond any doubt is in fact all this is, and it's something available to you. It's in your experience. Nobody has any doubt about that. So it's kind of a funny thing, we're studying and trying to get it and awaken and all these things, and seemingly going in and out of all of these things. But when you actually look at the simplicity of it, when you keep to the literalness of it, clearly your being has been here all along, with no doubt whatsoever, and it is here in all of its immediacy. And Sailor Bob, what he said to me one time, which he just said, John, didn't you know that was it? Didn't you realize that that's all it was? And I hadn't, because my mind had made it so complicated, and got into all this enlightenment and awakening and gurus and paths and going to India and all this stuff that I actually had never stopped long enough to really consider this idea that whatever I was seeking was already present and already here and already beyond doubt and already effortlessly available. And so that was like, for me, and this is my experience, let's say, was pointing out by somebody who knew. And he wasn't giving me a line about, when you get it. See, how could I, if I said to anybody in this room, and everybody already would know I would be like a con man or something, if I turned to you and I said, when you get it, I'd be throwing you off onto some kind of path looking away from the essence of it already. So what I discovered, which was the piece of it that I didn't really know, was that getting it pointed out really directly and simply what what it is. Look here, see this, and when we start to see that, and we can see it right now, the concepts and things come tumbling down immediately, because nobody has to go anywhere to be what they are. Nobody needs a special awakening or enlightenment to know that they are, or to be present. There's no path to that, really. Nobody's practicing to be. And there's nobody outside of yourself that has it. People go to these meetings and stuff, and they think, that some guy or some woman up there, sitting up there, has it. And I certainly used to think that. But if we keep that from the perspective of the basics of non-duality, we would never ever think that way again. Because if it's literally my being, our being, your being, there's not somebody sitting up there anywhere that actually has anything to do with that or has it or anything like that. So, but these are the little traps and things that we fall into. Because why? Because we overlook, because we miss the utter, kind of simplicity and the literalness of it. So this was what was pointed out, kind of underscored, so we could start to, and I think often that it doesn't get pointed out often enough, or it's not clear enough, or it's too overlaid with other inessential things. So like I like to say, basically like, right now, if for everybody here, before the next thought appears, without any question, without any examining or searching or figuring it, without reading Ramana, without reading anybody, without saying, what did Nisargadatta say, anything like that, without any thought, everything that this is present in your experience and easily known and has no doubt whatsoever. And that's what we want to kind of hammer on that and just really appreciate that. Because this is the thing that we tend to overlook, and so we miss this, not because it's complicated or we need to get awakened or we need to get it or we're missing it. We actually miss it because we don't appreciate the simplicity of the original point that you're already that. So and this is so what we can do, though, which is interesting and is fun to do, is now that once we get a sense of what we're actually looking at and what non-duality is pointing to, we can actually look directly at this undeniable sense of our own being, just out of curiosity, and appreciate what it is, and see what are all these all these sages and people been talking about. And the best way to see it is not to go read all the books, because that's just a concept. Those are words. The best way to do it is to drop all that and look directly into your experience now to see what is the nature of my being. And that's the difference between, that's why when that group came to talk to me and they were writing down all these things and they were studying all these non-duality things, I said, well, yeah, but that's not really what this is. And that actually leads you diametrically away from it. So here is your being. It'd be like sitting with, let's say you go out on a date with somebody and you meet this incredible person, right, and they're sitting there. And the whole evening you're just looking over here, talking about other things. and you're saying, when I meet my, the person of my dreams, it's going to be so amazing, and you're just going on and on. And you're sitting there the whole time. So, well, we wouldn't get to know them at all. We'd be so, So they're kind of tapping on your shoulders, So our true being, all these sages and traditions are telling us, has been here all along because of the "you are that" pointer, or your own mind is the Buddha, and yet somehow we have not been looking at that, or oftentimes we haven't. I mean, I'm sure many of you have, and you know what I'm talking about too. But once we say, "Oh, you mean that? You mean that's what it's about?" Oh, okay. And now we know where to look, and we know how to see it, and we can start to see, but then not going by anybody else's concept, but by going by our own direct experience. And then you'll find that it just instead of what is it, and you just see for yourself. Like one thing I can see, and all I do, one of the great things about this is that you don't need to know anything about spirituality. All you have to do is you just have to stop and look and see in your experience and just say what you see. So that's why I don't have to have anything to say, or any program or any teaching, because so that's why I was saying before that it's not really a teaching, because a teaching would be like a body of concepts or a knowledge, but what this is about is not that. So what are these people doing, in my view? This became clear to me later. They're not teaching. They're pointing to the presence of that reality in you. And the words is the least important of it, because your being is not a word, and your being is not a concept, and your being is not Vedanta, and it's not Advaita, and it's not Zen, it's not Buddhism. All these isms and concepts, I mean, they're interesting pointers, I guess, but mostly we get lost in them, and we study them, and one thing Ramana said, I do remember from years ago, it stuck with me, I still think it's true. He said, the self is not in a book. So why do you think that you'd ever come to know who you are by studying Vedanta books? And he said in his talks, thank God I never got interested in that, or I never would have gone anywhere, he said. Because, that when we are looking into the mind and into the concepts and we're studying, we're actually almost strengthening the muscle that's looking away from it. We can. And then you get all this knowledge and complexity and concepts and how it works, and you study so many teachers and you become an expert in all that. And probably, by the time you've invested in that, maybe a little bit of touch of pride, maybe like, well, all the stuff that I know. And then somebody comes along and says, well, that's irrelevant, or that's not really what this is. You have to look here. And sometimes there's like a little bit of attachment to that. Well, wait a minute. I've done all this activity. Like, what about all my spiritual seeking and searching, and all my awakenings, and all my retreats, and everything? It's like, it's okay if you see that it had nothing to do with it. Yeah.
So my question is how to stay here.
My question is how to leave it. but think about it though. I know I don't need to be too flippant about it, but if you look at if you really start to notice the fact of your being, right. And we'll talk about it more, because I don't want to just have this like little point, because there are many interesting and extraordinary things about what you are, what you already are. And so part of this is, as we point to it, we just begin to look at that, and it kind of fills in the understanding and the recognition of this being that you are right now, exactly what that is. Does it come and go? Is it something you can lose? Is it something that you can be separate from? All these things are quite interesting, and we can answer all these questions now that based not by thinking about it, but by looking in our experience. And then these kinds of questions will become self-evident. Because I used to think that even if there was such a thing as clarity or being or consciousness or peace or whatever, all these pointers, that it certainly comes and goes for me. And then it seemed like the name of the game was, how do I stay there? And stuff. But what we can do though is if we're willing to look and really once we know what we're looking at and start to really see and appreciate that, things will start to become apparent. Like, does it come and go, or can it come and go, or has it ever been absent, or is there anything? Now, it's not to say that people don't experience suffering or separation. But it's not what we will see though. It's not because you're leaving that. I mean, even in the pit of despair and darkness and concepts and all that stuff, you haven't disappeared, and the being is there. And one of the other pointers to our natural state or being is awareness or consciousness. And it's just another word for the same exact thing. So, this got pointed out to me one day when I was suffering and seeking and in the mind and thinking it's gone and all that, and I'm not there and all this kind of thing. And then it was pointed out to me that all that activity and thought and all that and the suffering, has the being really gone anywhere? Or aren't you still aware? Even you're still cognizing all that? And then I realized very, very quickly there was something I had missed, and that is that what we're talking about here hadn't gone anywhere. But to me it didn't seem like that, because I didn't really realize what they were pointing to. So it seemed to me like this reality of who we are, it seemed to be something that could come and go. But, in your life, in my life, and everybody here, in all of our experiencing, good, bad, indifferent, ups, downs, highs, lows, at work, in relationships, satsang, not, in all the activity, our very presence itself has never gone anywhere. Because you always had to be there. You always had to be cognizing everything. So when we start to look at that, this whole issue, you'll find that question actually, with just a little bit of looking into that it becomes very difficult to really even believe the question really, like it's possible. So the pointer is, and I'm just saying this kind of verbally, to say the basic idea is that your being never comes and goes, and you're never outside of that, and you couldn't even lose it if you wanted to. Like, how could you? Run around somewhere, try to escape it, or go somewhere here, go there, or something like that. So the practical thing, I just want to just touch on this, and then we can just kind of go free form, is that a lot of people have heard things like this, and I talk to them all the time, and they'll say things like, "Oh, I've heard that my nature is being," or I know that I'm awareness," and then they kind of slough it off. And they kind of go back to, I don't know what, something. And no, stop. It's not like that. It's not like, I know that I'm awareness and that's the end of the story. Now let me get back to my stuff. That's kind of like, opening up a door into the treasure chest, into the treasure room like Fort Knox, peeking open for like a half second and slamming it shut and saying, I already know what it is. So what I'm saying is that, because this being is what we are, and because it is present, and because everybody does have it, and because in my view it is what they're all talking about, because if you think about it, my opinion of this, every scripture, every sage, every tradition, every description of reality is describing that. You. So it's all about that. So. But so how could it be that we'd say, I know that, but I'm not that interested. Like, I've actually had people tell me, like, well, I know that they say it's my true nature, but I'm actually not interested in that. Because if somebody just says, like, being, the fact of being, I mean some people do say, so what? It's like I exist. What cares? I mean, it doesn't. Not that interesting. But that's why if you linger a little bit and kind of explore it a little bit, what is this being? What is this nature? What is my true nature? And that, then you'll actually start to, then it comes alive as something quite interesting. So, like one of the other main pointers, which I just mentioned, was everybody talks about consciousness. Sometimes, Ramana often talked about being, and it's just a word, but he sometimes talked about consciousness. But some traditions talk about awareness or consciousness, and that's their word for this. But, and again, rather than, what we have to see with that is that all of those are just somebody's attempt to say something in a word to get you to see what you are. It's not being, it's not consciousness, it's not emptiness, it's not spirit. All these descriptions are actually just pointers. So that's why we don't have to get that hung up with what they say. It's whatever you are. It's whatever stays with you, whatever you cannot lose, whatever is with you in every experience, in every thought, in every emotion, in every environment, in every state, waking, dream, everything. Whatever is the one essence that never departs. Whatever that is this. And then people say it in various ways. I tend to use awareness a lot, but there are reasons why that's, every pointer has its failing. Because, somebody may say, because why? Because those pointers are limited. The word awareness, or the concept of awareness, is not what you are. The word being or something like that is not what you are. So we have to only, but all of those things are trying to describe that. But, I think everybody would know without much hesitation that you're not a word. That whatever you are is not a word. So, and whatever you are is what this is about. So once we get that pointer, and we realize that's what we're looking at, that's what we're talking about, we're done with the spiritual pointers and words and what everybody else said about it. It doesn't really matter, because if you can be like me and study Ramana for 30 years and say, I know everything Ramana said about the self, but know nothing about who I am. And I'm glad I did all that, and it wasn't bad and everything like that. But there was a difference between that and stopping and pausing and seeing, for myself or for ourselves, what is the nature of that. And so just to give, I just want to touch on a couple of pointers, just so that we can get more of a sense. So I think if everybody looks at their own presence, their own being, even right now, it's not an inert, unconscious presence by any means at all. In other words, everybody can see quite clearly that what they are is not only present but aware. And those are the two big pointers: the being and the awareness part. I guess what I just want to stress is that that's a description of what is here. So your presence right now is totally awake, totally present, totally knowing, totally clear, cognizant, and present. And that's why, the awakening type of idea is kind of mythological and is misleading. Because the nature that you are is already wide awake and aware. So, there's a story that Buddha, he had his insight into this, and somebody said, well, who are you? What are you? He said, I am awake. That's what Buddha means, I am awake, or something like that. But people would think, oh, it happened to him. The event happened and he became awake. And I don't take it that way. I take it that seeing that what we are is the awakeness, or is the awareness itself. It's already that. So we can see that, and we can see. I just throw out a couple of things just for fun. Like watch your experience right now, your thoughts, your perceptions, and just see if this being presence goes anywhere, if it changes, if it's coming and going at all. And whether your thoughts are coming and going, the experiences are coming and going, your opinions might be coming and going. Anything can be coming and going, but is this coming and going on direct evidence, indirect experience? And I don't think that it is. So people talk about unchanging and all that stuff. Well, I guess I'll just wrap up this by saying, try to realize and understand and recognize that they're not describing an attainment or an event or a happening, they're describing the way it is already. And that's the difference, I think, in our minds as a seeker type level, at that stage where we don't see the simplicity of this. All these pointers like awake and being and the self and changeless, the mind kind of morphs them into an attainment that will happen to me. Instead of realizing that those sages were not saying that. They actually were not saying that. They were saying it's already present. So the being and the awakeness and the changelessness and the natural state and your true being is already present, fully present. And, Ramana said, I talk about him a lot, I guess because I did study his stuff and I met people that knew him. He said many, many times, there's no liberation. It's not even needed. It's not because he was saying, you're stuck forever and you can't get liberated. He's saying, the nature of our being is such that it is already free by nature and it doesn't need any special event. So he said somewhere that this notion of liberation is too provocative for people's minds because it promotes all this notion that they don't have it. So rather than seeing what is being pointed to, I am already that, all these qualities are already here beyond any doubt, and I'm not separate from that even now, and that's what it is, full stop, and kind of, okay, let's take a deep breath and realize it's all over with. Didn't you know it was already over with? Didn't you know you never need to go to another satsang as long as you live and it won't make any difference to this? Because you're still going to be present and aware and you're going to be whatever you are and that you already are that, and that's what they were trying to say all along, and so on and so forth. So that's why people say that, but we somehow that's what we miss, and then we just go off on this tangent of but if you take something like, people often say, yeah, but when is it going to happen? So what I like to do, and I guess what we can do in the rest of this meeting for these questions, we'll get to some of the questions, was look at the question. Like I like to look at this true nature, your being, as like the gold standard, as the reference point. So take that as the standard, as what this is about, and then take any of these questions and then look at them in the light of that. Like, so somebody says to you, or we think in our minds, gee, I sure hope it happens. So just come back and look at, how does that relate to your present being? And see if that even makes sense. Like, when is my being going to happen? Or does it need to happen? And then what happens, you realize the question is misconceived. Some people say, well, when will the shift happen? When will the awakening happen? When will I get it? Or they'll say, so-and-so has it, all these things. But if you have that kind of reference point, that gold standard, so to speak, of knowing what you're looking at, you can easily look at any of these issues and see whether they make sense or not. Does anybody in this room have to have an awakening to be? Do they have to have a special series of moments? Do they have to go anywhere? Do they have to, people, somebody said over here, it's like something about, what's the mechanics of sitting in your presence, and how does it work? Well, what do you mean? Your being is it. It's not my, I don't have any presence, I don't have any, people get these far-fetched things like there's a transmission happening. I don't know, I don't have any transmission. Because who needs, it just, when you are that, people say, you are that, you're the, in to speak, spiritually speaking, the supreme reality. The ultimate value. That's what you are. And we're talking about going around to meetings to get transmissions when you are that. So, that's how, we think that way. And it's okay and all that stuff. But it's from a perspective of not seeing the final perspective. And because if you, that's what I was saying before, if you think about the implications of what it means to be that and not to turn it into a becoming and a someday and go into all these contortions around it, but be willing to stay and hold to, I am that. That's what I am. And not waver on that. Not fudge it like they do. You're that, but when you get stabilized in it, then, see, to me that's a compromise. That's a kind of something I don't really adhere to that. Certainly not what Nisargadatta said. That's certainly not what Sailor Bob told me, and that was not my experience. They didn't say, you are that, but when you do this, and then you find yourself back into this thing of like saying, yeah, but I'd like to be there all the time. See, I tried to pull that with Bob a few times. Because, anybody, we can also, well, I know what he's talking about. I'm present and aware. I am what I am. There's no doubt about my being. I can see these things. There's nothing, no rocket science about that. But you start to get a taste of that. You start to get a feel for that. It's pretty nice. It's like so simple and clear and easy and that. And now I kind of like starting to know that. I can see that. That's amazing. And then instead of just, it's like your mind comes in and says, I want to stay there now. And of course, I used to get these funny looks coming back from him because he's like, what do you mean, stay there, And, sometimes, and then of course I would instantly, I would kind of catch that. Like my mind was still kind of hoodwinking me a little bit. I'd say like, I want to achieve this. Or what happened, I said to him one time, yeah, but what happens when I leave here and I go back home and I go back to work? And I was kind of going down this whole track of like, what's going to happen? And I got one of those blank looks. What do you mean what's going to happen? You're going to be at work. You're going to be present and aware. You're going to be what you are. What are you talking about? Oh, okay. And I dropped it. I went back to work and no problem. And there was no problem because everything that we are is at work. So, a lot of these funny ideas about, I got to be somewhere special. Or, for many, many years, I misread Ramana quite intensely by equating this with a silent mind. Because you can read those texts that way where it seems like they're saying you actually got to get mentally kind of still. And tried many, many years to be quiet. Didn't have any value, didn't work, didn't do anything. But because I thought that somehow, because I was thinking, if I can just get my mind still enough, then I will get the realization.
Sheldon,
yeah.
Could there be something, though, about shutting up and listening? That's what the silent mind is?
Could be, yeah. There's probably some value. In any of these pointers, there's probably a nugget of something useful. But I found that for me, I could only understand those things with reference to this essential already being that. If that wasn't clear, and then I went off trying to figure out the pointers, it just became complicated. Because I thought I want to get my mind still so that I can see this, or that I can realize this, or basically what I actually thought. Someday my mind will become still. Then the realization will happen.
It won't become still, not while you're breathing and living.
Well, that's what I finally found out. Yeah, good luck with that one.
Really?
And even if you can get it still, you still don't know who you are. So basically you go into some samadhi, and my mind was very still. And if you don't have that little guidance or that little push or that little looking inward to see what's there, even when you're still or not still, then you just come out and you say, well, I achieved samadhi, my mind was still, and basically then people are like, well, now what?
Yeah, exactly.
It didn't happen. And then you're stuck, So even if most people can't achieve a still mind, first of all, I don't think you have to, but a few that do, it doesn't even really mean that you would still realize, that what's being pointed to, like, your presence isn't dependent on a still mind. Because that aware presence, that knowingness that never changes, is just what's cognizing the samadhi anyway. But it's also cognizing your active mind. And if you can see that, and you don't have to still the appearance. So you can actually see that and know that and have a clear sense of all this without even going down that track. Now, maybe sometime way back when, and in some contexts, people may have used that. And that's okay too, because there are all these pointers, and I'm not trying to deny that there are pointers and techniques and other things that people have used all kinds of things. But even me sitting here talking about it is just another pointer. It's not it. Now, it may not work for them. It may not be the right background or tone or language, and they might so there's nothing special about it. But somebody may have used samadhi, or they may have used mantra, or they may have used all these things. But to point to something or to try to get us to be in a position to want to look in that direction. So, but nobody has to still their, even right now, nobody has to have a still mind to know that they are. And that was the thing that was very helpful for me, and that might be helpful to some others too. Because I thought it was, actually. I was pretty convinced that somehow my mind had decided that somehow that was part of it. And I spent many, many years in my little room, on my little cushion, by myself, wrestling with myself. Who am I, who am I, who am I? Trying to, remember those, God, some of those translations are pretty gnarly. Destroy the mind.
Well, excuse me, I have a good mind. I think I'd like to use it while I've got it.
Or destroy the ego or something. Now, notice in this whole discussion, nobody's destroyed any ego. So I think there's a different meaning of that. See, and we'll just say this, and then I'll definitely try to wrap up, because you can kind of go on. It's a funny thing. There's nothing you can say about this, because it's a concept. But you can also go on forever. So I don't want to go too long on it. But the ego idea, this is like demystifying the ego. The ego is this assumption that you stand apart from being. Does anybody in this room stand outside or apart from their being? No. So the ego is not a thing, it's not a reality, it's not something to destroy, it's not an actual physical or psychological presence. It's an unexamined notion that there is such a thing that is separate from my natural state. And so when we look at that, when we examine that to see, is that what I am? Is there such a thing? Can I even find such a thing? Or am I that thing? Or in my experience, do I actually stand separate from who I am? What we find is that the concept of the separation is not tenable. It doesn't make any sense. It's not a valid judgment. And that's the ego, and that's the end of the ego. Now, people are getting into this stuff, the dark night of the soul, and the collapse of my world, and the agony, and the torture of it, and the coming back, and it arising, and the ego took me, and wait, much too dramatic. So these teachers tell us, basically instead of doing that whole thing, is there an ego? Or what is the ego? Because if, the ego is, people say, it's the sense, it's like the word I, like the notion I as a separate being, me. So, if we look at that, see, because commonly when we say me at some stage, we think I'm just a limited person, and there's, I'm small, and separate from reality, and that's me. So, and then all the suffering comes from that. It's only that me idea that wants to get enlightened or practice or attain anything. It's not the being doesn't want to get enlightened, because it's already awake. So all of the personal suffering and all the spiritual suffering and all of the seeking and all the concepts are all based on the concept of the separate ego. So, but if we look at that and examine that, just like we're looking at these other things, what is the me? Or who am I? What am I actually? We're going to see a couple of things, and both are just fine. One is we see that me is only an idea that comes and goes, and that's not what I am. So the conceptual me is not my true nature, and we see that, and that unlinks that identification with that, because okay, let the ego get enlightened, let it suffer, let it do whatever it wants to do, because that's just about that image, but that's not what I am. It doesn't describe me. Or if we look at that sense of me and say, what am I actually, and we actually trace it back to what I actually am, what my real presence is, we discover the true self, the true presence, the true being. And then I am that already, so that's pretty good. So it's like if we look at this me as either the imaginary self and see that that's not what I am, that kind of resolves the suffering based on that. But if we take that sense of me to refer to the true self, so to speak, then we find I already am that. effortlessly, and there's no separation. And both are, sometimes when I talk about this, both sides of that are useful to see what I'm not, and also to see what I truly am. And some of the teachers have said something like that. I think it was Nisargadatta. He said something like stop being what you're not and don't refuse anymore to be what you are. So because it's like, in practice, what does this really look like? It looks like the best way to describe it is like a sense of confusion on identity. I don't know who I am. I haven't looked at my being. It's not clear what that is. Nobody's pointed it out. I haven't stopped long enough to notice it. So my mind has stepped in. The mind has stepped in and said, I'll tell you what you are. And it's not malicious. It's just saying, look, if you don't know, you're looking, you want to know, I'll try to tell you what you are. And the closest it can come up with is this sense of a conceptual self. Even though that's only a concept, but we don't really spot that. And then, then we begin to think that image is what I am, and the mind begins adding to that, and it puts more and more things on it, And so and then at some, in our life we find ourselves suffering under this kind of wavering identity, like what am I? And the mind is saying all these things, like you're limited, you're not enlightened, you're not good enough, you're small, you're unsatisfactory, whatever. But that's not you, though. See, that's the mental picture of you. But at some stage, since we haven't stopped and looked at this, we are basically believing that, and we think that that's what I am. And that is not a pretty sight, usually. I mean, the separate self notion and all these ideas, if you look at them, they are mostly negative. They're not really, there are some good ones, but they're largely kind of limited. Why? Because the very notion of being a separate self outside of reality is already a huge come down. It's already a huge limitation. So the very core concept on which everything is based on is already a limitation. So all these other things, and we try. It doesn't feel right. I mean, it's like children already at a young age, they start to feel uncomfortable being a separate someone. But we try to, instead of actually getting to the root of that and trying to take it back and see what's going on, we keep trying to correct that by throwing all these antidotes onto it. And it just kind of makes it can make it accentuate it. So it feels like, those jawbreakers, they add layers and layers of candy on. So it's like this mind idea gets from the I thought, like a pearl or oyster or something like that, from that little seed, it gets another layer. I'm a body, I'm a John Wheeler, I'm a spiritual being, I'm not enlightened, I'm not good enough, I'm this, I'm a person. And each and every one of those things is just an idea. But until we question that, until we come back to look at this who am I question, the odds are we're going to, every time the mind comes up and says something like that, we'll go, oh, that's true. There's something wrong with me. And even the spirituality itself can be just an addition onto that thing itself. That's why all the teachings, the Buddhism and all these things, and they do say that at some stage the teaching itself, the satsang, the language, the pointers, all that gets discarded. It has to get discarded. Because you can't spend the rest of your life being a seeker going for awakening or something and not there yet. That's not going to cut it. Because that does not, it's not satisfying. It's actually suffering. If you see what your being is and don't pick up a concept, it has no suffering, it has no problems. There's nothing wrong with the being. The moment I pick up the idea that I need to get enlightened, I've already started suffering. So there was a Zen story where somebody said to the teacher, what's the cause of suffering? And he said, seeking enlightenment. But I think now these tricky Zen stories, wow, that's a heavy one. That's amazing. Somebody said the same teacher said, what's the cause of the ignorance? And he said, trying to get rid of it. Why? Because the notion that I have ignorance and there's something wrong with me and I'm engaged in this process of getting rid of it is already a concession to the reality of it. But if we pause that construct and that concept to see what actually is and what I am and what is present, that is not bound in that ignorance and it's not limited and it's not suffering. And so even if there's one of these things that people are doing in a lot of meetings and groups is trying to get rid of their conditioning. So, but that's one of those little false traps too. Question?
John, I think what I've been reflecting on is, I know it's a pointer, I know there's a limitation of language. The word you and yours. The moment you say your beingness, you are that. It's two. You, that, yours, beingness. And
it can be taken that way, but
well,
yeah.
I'm saying for myself, I'm not
Yeah.
questioning you, this is for
Yeah, don't
for
forget
myself.
the R.
Okay, but I've been reflecting and reading your books and reflecting, and I feel like I've been stuck.
Mm-hmm.
Is what holds the beingness, because it's so, your beingness, you are. So it's like, it's the you. The obstacle for me is somehow it's impossible for me to let go of a you without thinking of somebody pointed to me and said you.
Yeah.
They're pointing to Mike, Sadlo, I live at this address, and then all my thoughts, whatever it's well, you're not your body, you're not a concept, but maybe I'm my thoughts or what. There's a lot of you. There's that when you say you, it's a very loaded, and I'm just living in the question for myself that it's like, when you say your being, then, but if I'm identifying yours as something, meaning mine, meaning the ego you, the ego your,
I see what you're saying.
Then something, me, wants to hold this beautiful thing called being.
Yeah.
So I'm still, if you get where I'm saying, so the question is what holds being and what shows up in the world? How do you show up in the world, or how should one show up in the world and hold being, but not as a you being or your being, if you get what I'm trying to...
Well, first of all, your being is kind of redundant. So drop the word you, just being. Now, the word you, or all these things come up later as concepts, as appearances. So clearly they're not... so not only is the word you a pointer, but the word being is a pointer. So what happens if you, and I'm totally supportive of you dropping any of those pointers.
Yeah.
Drop the word you, drop the word being, to see what is here that can't be denied. And it's not personal. It has nothing to do with you.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with me. It's not sitting in a chair.
No.
And you're talking about what holds it, but I would more be inclined to say that whatever that is what's holding everything else. And it's not a personal you. It's not like you're sitting there with it. So it is helpful to drop that out. Yeah. So that's why we have to try to use these words kind of gingerly without putting too much weight on them. Just use them. And maybe sometimes sometimes people do react to that particular style, like you. So wait a minute, that accentuates the ego. But some people have used that, like, Ramana used to call it the self, and a lot of people have trouble with that because it's like, well, the self sounds too much like the ego, it sounds too personal. But I think he was actually explaining one time, he said, well, it's because it's the most intimate thing. But let's actually just admit that none of these words and pointers and concepts are going to cut it, and just be willing to let it go. And then just not have to put a label on it. And then go by direct seeing, because that being is not a personal thing. That's all.
That was helpful. It's just very, very tricky because it's almost impossible for me not to say you're a being.
Yeah, and you can't say that if you're light with it and you don't.
Yeah.
See, where does all the trouble the trouble, it's very revealing too, because what you're saying is that concept of the you becomes the seed of all the crap. Because once there's a me or a you, that limited person bears the brunt of all this stuff. And if we have a little bit of unclarity on that, see, if we see that you as just a concept, and that's not what I am, and that's just a pointer and all that, and there's no really wavering on that, then we could use it like anything else. But if there's some potential there to somehow, well, maybe that's what I am, or maybe there's, then maybe that could become like, the beginning of all the concepts want to glom onto that and say, well, wait a minute, if I'm here, then that must mean there's this beautiful thing called being. And then suddenly, how do I piece it together, and what do I do? And I guess I'm not there, I'm not deep enough for it. So, but to see that then the being in what we are, and I guess that's whatever that is, there is no you in that. There's no body in that. There's no separation in that. And there's nobody that stands out of it either. I mean, all the language really just becomes almost like meaningless, because you can't really say anything valid. You say, you never leave this. It supposes that you are some entity that could potentially leave it, or that you're in it, or something like that, or come back to this or see this. It implies that you don't. The truth of it is, when you drop all the concept, it's all that's really present. And just like that, so, yeah.
So what is present in sleep, in deep sleep? No sense of awareness, no sense of nothing.
No problems.
So maybe that's what Buddha meant by awake.
Yeah. Well,
there's nothing else.
Well, that's why I've been kind of migrate a little bit to the to the idea that there's a way of talking about this whole thing where what you're saying, and I would agree with too, and it's a common sense thing, is that consciousness comes and goes. It could be looked at that way. That when I'm in deep sleep, the consciousness is no longer there, and that's what Buddha taught. That's what Nisargadatta taught.
So now,
but we, at some level of existence, at some level of knowing, even in this moment, we are quite cognizant of these facts of waking, dream, and deep sleep. And there is something, all I would say is I think that there's a deeper level, or I don't know what you want to call it, but there is some aspect of what we are, of this essence, that clearly recognizes and can cognize and discuss all of these things with total confidence. Like, I know there's a waking, I know there's a dream. Like you said, well, I know in dreamless sleep there's no consciousness and there's nothing happening there, and I know exactly that. Well, how do you know? So there's a point there that's kind of interesting to contemplate, and I'm not saying I can't just say there is, but it's just it's fun to explore. Is there anything there still? Because my view, just to be clear and frank about it, is there clearly is something there. Because I just say in plain language, I was asleep.
Well, someone else. Now again, now we're bifurcating here. But someone sees the body, says yes. That body's been there. I've been watching the body for 8 hours.
Yeah,
and
but that just becomes very, very hypothetical, because then we're not. It's very important in this, in my view, to always stay with direct experience, not cogitating and thinking about all these edge cases. Right now, I know beyond any doubt that you're there, that you exist, that there's a presence there, and we're not debating that. Now, the nature of deep sleep and what other bodies see when I'm asleep, now we're debating kind of like scenarios out there, which is fine, and there can be reasonable discussions about that. But I would say be very sensitive to in that question, in that discussion, you're moving away from what this is really about.
Well, but really the heart of that is to question whether the source of everything is the body. that perhaps is all the body.
Yeah, but what is more emphatic again? I mean, those, yeah, that is true. But the real essence of it is you have a being now, and these qualities of what is present are here now, and they're not theoretical, and they're not hypothetical, and you don't have to go into deep sleep, and you don't have to prove anything logically. And I think you might find, and I've done all those things, and I studied Vedanta and all that stuff, and again, I think that you can have reasonable, rational discussions and have kind of cogent answers for what is deep sleep, am I the body, am I this, I am that. But it has very little to do with what I'm talking about. In fact, in most cases, it makes it more complicated. Because, see, who's doing all that investigation and questioning and kind of yammering on? It's the mind. It's the conceptual mind. And if you can see something that's pointed out to me, and I'm using the you word, but basically, but what you are is not in the conceptual mind. That you're aware of the mind, and your being or your presence is actually not in that. You're not a concept. And then you realize we're actually looking directly at that fact of the being itself, not thinking about it. So that's the problem with some of those kind of, if you study Vedanta or whatever like that, most people, it's like they migrate to using the mind as the instrument of the inquiry, and they're analyzing it all. And well, what about deep sleep, and what about this, and am I the body, and who's asking all those questions? Here's the being just sitting here shining in all of its immediacy with no doubt whatsoever, like the date sitting there, totally present. And what we're really doing a lot in those discussions is we're actually focusing completely on the conceptual mind.
Is it not just the being as stillness or the being as mind?
Could be. Yeah. You could look. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to look at it. But I'm saying, I guess I'm advocating, don't lose touch or don't look away. See that this mind and these questions are going to come and go. Like probably at lunchtime you'll forget everything about deep sleep and you won't even care about it. You'll be saying, well, what's for lunch? So I mean, you don't have to hang out. I mean, I would say if you do, be aware of the limitation of that realm of that discussion. You know, when this was pointed out to me, I mean, I studied all those things and all the Shankara and all that, endless scholars debating, perception and consciousness and awareness until I was blue in the face. And it wasn't, I mean, it didn't really help so much. But the thing is, I forgot what I was going to say. But, when this was pointed out to me, there was no discussion of, am I the body, and is there deep sleep, what about perception, what about this? Not even one discussion. And yet, what I found was interesting is all those questions got answered. Because from the position of the being, a lot of those kinds of questions that trouble the mind, they kind of are almost like self-evident. And that's just my recommendation, kind of what I saw, because it's like I think the only way I could explain that is when we're pursuing all those tricky Advaita questions, my view is that we're using the mind as the instrument to try to find certitude or get the answer, and we're using the wrong tool. I mean, the philosophers have been debating, am I the body, is there a God, is there a free will, for thousands of years. There's no answer yet out there. So if those guys who have tried it, they've tried to figure it out and they haven't answered it, do I think I'm going to answer and come to some kind of certitude? However, if I turn to the fact of being right now, it's totally certain. And there's no doubt whatsoever. And it's like, wow, that's interesting. So like, how certain are you of being? Or that presence of being right now is vividly aware with no effort. It's like so, and that is more of a way that I found of how this, when people talk about knowing or seeing for yourself, that's more what they're talking about. They're not talking about go study Vedanta and prove whether I exist in deep sleep, because that is not certain. Even if you could say, logically I was there, and there must have been consciousness because I remember that there was nothing happening. They always say, I remember nothing and I was happy. Therefore, you must have been there because you have to read blah 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 blah. The truth of it is, you're still not. It's not certain at all.
So the 1, 2, 3, 4 states, all of that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was all just techniques and tools and other methods that people used at one stage to try to get us to see this. Like in our experience, in our thoughts, in our dreaming, in our waking. Let's leave the deep sleep aside temporarily, because people start getting into that one. But basically the idea is in all of our experiencing there's something. And I think once we get the point that there's something, then we can drop all the 3 states and all that stuff. Let's get into the something. And that something is here. It's not... so a lot of times people, they take these pointers, and instead of going to where the pointer is pointing, they go to where they get all into the pointer, and they say, well... So I think if these things had any use to try to highlight the fact of what's present, get that taste of that, then drop the pointer, and then get into what's here. Because there's something here that has no doubt. It doesn't depend on Vedanta or whether you're in deep sleep. Yeah.
Well, maybe this is redundant, but first, before when, I mean, I think I get the idea that I'm already here. And before when you were saying, well, the beingness just doesn't disappear. I mean, you feel like everything comes and goes, but you can always know that you're being. Well, to me, when it disappears is you die.
But you haven't died yet, so it's totally theory.
Right.
You don't actually know by direct experience.
No, but to me that's no different than anything I knew before I started studying all this. I mean, to me that's no different.
But your being is here, and you don't have any doubt about that.
Yeah, but I never did. That wasn't why.
Well, but all I would say is get to know that and see how incredible it is.
Okay, good. That leads to my next question.
Okay.
It's all related. It's the same question, really. But I've read, in various readings, and I read your book, You Were Never Born. When you look, I don't know, I can't say the words exactly. I'm not going to try and.
Mm-hmm.
The way I heard it as, look beyond the concepts, and it will be obvious, it will be undeniable what you are. But I guess I want to say, well, walk me through that, because I don't, I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure how I can prove by looking inward that I'm other than a person, with a body and nothing more than that. So I feel like maybe there is something I'm missing when I assume that I'm being. Maybe it's conceptual.
Well, first of all, you don't need to read my book or anybody's book to know that you are, or to know that existence is. So that's the danger and downfall of all these spiritual books, is that everything in those books is kind of conceptual and doesn't really need to be known. But I'm just advocating the point that you do have a being, and it's not theoretical. And because it does exist, and because it's present, we can look or consider it or reflect on it or begin to get curious about it to simply see what is the nature of it. Now, and I think the best thing to do is not to say, if we say, well, John says I'm not the body and it's unborn and it's all these things. To me, that can lead into all kinds of conceptualizing, and it becomes more frustrating. So forget all that. Forget what I said. Forget all these things. And if you're drawn to it, if there's a resonance, and I think I just say from personal experience, I believe it is a worthwhile thing to do, because for me it led to the end of seeking and the end of suffering. Now, that's just encouragement. I can't, but not because I read about it and because somebody said my being doesn't have any suffering or anything like that, because that wasn't enough. But I did find that that somehow I got interested in saying, well, you know, this sense of being that I know is not theoretical, it's not conceptual, it's not somebody's opinion that I'm present here.
Mm-hmm.
So I just was more encouraged to start to look, like I was doing before in the meeting. What is the nature of that?
Well, how do you get from that, which is knowing that you are there and you're aware and you're present, to I am that? I don't. That doesn't resonate. That doesn't resonate.
Unfortunately, you're going back into the conceptual mind at that point. The I am that was to get you to see the being. Now drop all the pointers.
And
now
the I am that stays a concept.
It will always be a concept, and it's false. Yeah. Just like he was saying, just like
all the sages say this, and it's like the big deal. And
well,
it never has resonated. The other part makes sense.
About what you are?
I am.
Yeah.
I am aware, I'm present in this moment.
Exactly.
It totally resonates.
Yeah.
I am that.
Yeah.
It just floats by.
Because it's a concept. And because
I thought that was the key.
It was the concept to encourage somebody way back when to look at what you already see.
Whew.
So if you go back to that concept, you're descending back into stuff that you don't need anymore.
I thought that was the most critical thing of all.
It was for somebody at some stage. but you already know what they were trying to say. So let the pointer go. And that's why Nisargadatta said, we're at the start when I said all these people were studying his teachings, but when he died he said, forget my teachings. He knew exactly what you're saying, is that if you just keep going back to all the words, it's not it. So when you drop all the words and you don't even think I am that, and it just, you are what you are, that. And, because it's present, and because it is a reality, because it's not conceptual, and because it's who we are, or however you want to say it, we can actually come to understand it, recognize its quality, see the truth of that. Because it's not rocket science to say, well, I am aware, I am present, I have a nature of some sort, and it's worthwhile to, if you feel, you may or may not even be interested. You might just say, hey, there's nothing wrong with me anymore. Because being, but it's, we can look at that to see, because it's to see what is the nature of my being? Is it a thought? Is it a concept? Does it have any suffering? Does it come and go? All these things to me are totally, we can resolve them very easily. Not by studying I am that or something like that, because then we're only studying somebody else's pointer. But the only way you can see this stuff is by checking it out to see what do I actually see about the nature of being. And that's the as they say in those traditions, that's where the words and thoughts turn back, because you can't take the I am that, thou art that. You can't take it there. It's like,
I'm glad.
It's like a backpack full of boulders, you got to let it go.
Really?
So you don't need to so somebody said I am that, somebody who didn't know who they were, they said there's a reality, you are that, and the person said, well, what does that mean? And they looked to see that they are.
Yeah.
And then the pointer was discarded, and then they said, oh, I've looked at that, I know this as my direct experience. That's when the Buddha's wrath is thrown overboard. Because he actually says in there, he said, if you keep following the Dharma too long, it will poison you.
Oh, God.
Because his whole Dharmic teaching is only concepts. So when you get to that so-called other shore, as they say, just a metaphor, but you don't keep carrying that around, because it would kill you, because it's a burden. So it is, I'm glad you can see that. We are permitted to let go of the pointers. And you're also permitted to stop going to satsang, and stop pursuing awakening, and stop going to other people that have a transmission. It's all bullshit, because none of that applies. Because you have everything. Because that pointer, even though it's a conceptual pointer, what it was basically saying is, that is it. And
well, John, I'm thinking what both of these people are saying, and the idea that's sort of rattling around in my head is the I am that indicates
my recognition of being part of everything, like the oneness.
Okay.
And if I am simply aware of my being and presence, that doesn't mean that, you know, you and I are part of the same thing. I know that
Well,
I am here and
yeah.
she is there,
But is the being really there? Or where? See, that's why when you look more into the nature of what being is it a thing located somewhere? You know, is it in a body? Is it sitting in that chair? You know, and it's. And I'm not. I don't want to just give it an answer and say, oh, it's all one and blah blah blah. But I'm just saying, let's be willing to get curious to see, because of course, when the first time we hear about being or consciousness, that it's very natural to think, well, you know, it's right in here. It's like sitting here in this body, and it's like something very small. Well, that can't be unconditioned. But that's okay. But at least we have, you know. And some people at that point, they'll discard the whole endeavor. Say, well, it's obvious that the consciousness or the being is limited, and it's just mine. That can't be what this is. Because they say, well, I've had experiences of spirit, transcendent love, and things that are just so incredibly vast, and it seems like the being is somehow small. But it's worth lingering on that and exploring to see if that initial evaluation is actually true. Is the living being, the actuality of that, is it actually sitting in the chair? Is it in the body? Or not, or is it mine? Does he have one and I have one? These are common things. It's logical. I mean, it makes people would commonly say, you know, John is conscious, he's sitting here, and then you're conscious, and then you have a different consciousness and stuff like that. And then it's like it's kind of confusing in a certain way, because how does that make sense?
Yeah, I think my question was, can you read? So how do you get from, how do you look in to see the non-duality, that it's not just non-conscious?
Well, I guess my advice is to I guess I would say start with that. It's a pointer, but it's just like somebody saying, you know, give it a try, or it might be worth it. But start with the fact of the being itself. And see and look at it. I mean, and see it, and kind of get curious about it, and don't immediately just go by somebody's concept. And I would say, you know, don't. I mean, my books and all that was just my attempt to tell somebody what I thought based on my experience. But if you go to my book, it's going to screw you up. So drop all that. I know, but drop all that and realize that, you know, I still think you do have a being, so to speak, however you want to say that, that there is presence, and get curious and have a look and start to explore to see what is that.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't trying to single out your book. I found your book really interesting. I
Yeah.
know all kinds of books by all kinds.
Well,
of
but that I'm just saying is that, you know, that they can. Again, you know, it's like he was saying with the pointer. There's a point in there when you grasp, when you realize, oh, this is what I'm looking at, where it's like there's like a fork in the road, so to speak. I mean, that reading about it no longer suffices, because it's not you knowing your nature as it is anymore.
No, I get that, and I am curious, and I've been curious. This started for me like 2 years ago when I had a life-threatening encounter, and I had a brush with death.
Yeah.
That started me looking at all this stuff. So I'm sure there's a very real part of me, I guess the ego in quotes, that wants to, is hoping, is looking for a part of me that transcends, you know, the part of me that may not just be what I think I am, something that is born and just.
Well, that's what everybody in this room, I'm sure, relates to that.
Yeah, I'm sure also.
Because, you know, another way of saying that, how I would see that is, you know, your identity of who you thought you were took a big hit and took a big challenge.
Yeah.
Because the things that are life, and I had the same thing. I went through a big illness, and it shook me up, because all my assumptions about what I thought my life was, the security of the body, the security that things would always be the same, and that it was all hunky-dory, and I kind of it suddenly wasn't so obvious or so evident anymore. So basically what's happening there is that this sense of identity in the mind, this conceptual definition or personality, is suddenly getting exposed to it's not the way it is, or it may not be sufficient somehow. And so that identity coming under question. And that, to me, that's the beginning of spirituality. Somebody that says, I know who I am, I'm totally confident that what I am, I'm a seeker, this is exactly what I am, I know they haven't even started yet. Because they're still living in an unquestioned identity, saying, well, I know exactly what I am. So it's like when that tone of doubt enters in, where suddenly it's like, I'm not so sure I know who I am. That's, to me, when the real the sincere questioning begins. Because then something is saying, oh, I need to find out, I want to know exactly, truly what I actually am. And I'm not satisfied with what I used to think because I suddenly saw that compromised. Mm-hmm. And that gets us going into the... So essentially what we're doing, what you're doing unconsciously or consciously, is, who am I anyway? And we don't know the answer because it's like that stage, because if we knew the answer, we'd just, well, okay. But we know the question. And sometimes the right question is better than the right answer. Because because that answer that I think is right or I'm so sure of might not be correct. But just to have that question about what am I and be curious about that to me opens the door to an openness to consider and question and to examine things. Well, what am I? Because that question, Ramana's great question was literally that. Who are you? And it wasn't so much saying, well, okay, he's going to tell us you're this. Because the problem with that is it doesn't work. Because it just, even if it's the highest pointer, you're the self, you're this, it doesn't work because it's just a concept. Okay, Ramana says I'm the self, and then you sit there and you feel good for a couple days. But it's like we still don't really know, for ourself. Well, it's great that he's the self, or whatever. So, we can't settle for just saying, so and so says I'm this, and that's why even I can't really just blurt out some answer to either of you. Say, well, this is the way that you exist in deep sleep. That's the way it is. That's the answer, because it's not gonna really work. Because in your mind you're gonna say, well, yeah, but what is he? Maybe he's bullshitting. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But if you start looking at your being for yourself, your own presence in your own eyes, and see for yourself, everything that you see will be self-evident, firsthand, confirmed by your own direct knowing, and you won't have any doubt, at least about what you see. And you'll be on a different level of confidence. You'll say, oh, I've seen this, and I've seen that, and I know this. Now, I may not know this and that and the other thing, but whatever that we have looked and we've seen, we will have a very clear knowledge such that God himself could come down from the heavens and say, you're not present, and you'd say, sorry, God, you're wrong. Because you couldn't say it, you couldn't, even to God or something, you couldn't say I'm not here. And you actually have to be face to face with God telling him that he was wrong, based on direct experience. But we can continue to look, once we know what we're looking at and what's present, we can continue to explore. And it's very exciting and fun and interesting and rewarding to do that. After all, everybody wants to know who they are, and everybody's favorite topic is themselves. And it's like you're given permission to make that the focus of your studies. And you may discover some wonderful things. I think that you will discover things about yourself and about what your nature is that you never even knew or dreamed was even possible. About what is this. And it's worth it. But I'm just saying that's my opinion. I would say I think it's worth it, and maybe you would try it,
No, I think it's worth it too. I'm just not sure. I feel like I hit a wall. I'm very curious, and I'm just not sure how.
Well, we're kind of doing it in this meeting, and it's just getting curious about the topic, having a clear sense of what we're looking at, and being willing to start to look. And that's about, you can't just give a blueprint. Yeah?
I just say, this all seems great. It's very simple, direct, effortless, and all of that. And I get
Well, that's
What
not.
I'm
That's nothing
getting
to
from it is
sneeze
that-
at. I mean, that's not too bad.
Yeah, okay. Well, what I'm getting is that, okay, there's this idea of a me. It's just an idea.
Okay.
And so, but what you're saying is no, it's actually just the simplest thing. It's just what you are. It's just beingness, right? And so that feels good and direct and all of that. But at the same time, it feels like there's this concept that at some point, if I stay with this simple sense directly in my own immediate experience, if I stay with this long enough, or give it the right kind of nurturing or the right amount of time, whatever that is, that eventually it will only be that, and this idea, which was always just an idea, will somehow just fade away. And you hear people talk about, I became liberated on, December 7th, 19, whatever.
Yeah, I think that's all wrong, but see, the way you're asking the question, as you can see, the being, the simple being, effortless being, is present.
Right.
Now, your whole thing about if I stay, you're already back in the story.
Right.
Forget all that.
John?
This isn't about you as an entity staying in the simple being and then someday I'll get this, because that's in the image.
Right.
So see that.
Right.
That kind of story in the mind about an I itself is just a passing idea in the simple, effortless being
Right. But
that is
that should be it.
here.
Right?
It is it. Unless you pick up a concept. The being is it. It's already here. It's effortless.
Right. So that's...
So you only...
No question.
By asking the question, you inserted, yourself back into the concept, as if you were a limited being that was separate from that.
Right.
So without the
idea
question,
that there's a split, that there's somehow this directness and this other thing.
Is that?
False.
But in direct experience, is it really even like that? It's like there's this being that's here, and there's a few ideas coming and going in that, and that's it. And you aren't a separate, defective person standing apart from this being, are you? Okay, so it is, literally it's that simple. It took me 30 years to see that. So you can see that, when Sailor Bob said, look, this is what it is, this is what you are, there has been no separation.
Right.
That's it. Now, just the implication of that is kind of staggering, really. That you're not a being who doesn't know this. You're not a being separate. You're not a separate person that needs to abide in this. Because in direct experience, you're not even out of it. And this notion, when the mind went into this thing of I'd like to stay in the being and all that, right in that question, have you actually moved out of the being? So mind just rambling on this imagination about this fictitious kind of I thing, and we're thinking that's what I am. If you can see right then that even that notion of the I is coming and going, and I still remain as what I am. And literally, if we just take it right there, that's all you need to see. That's what they're trying to tell us, is that you're the being or whatever, and this image of the I is just a passing concept, and it has all these stories of separation, and it's all just a construct. And even when it's appearing, it doesn't alter the fact. So do you have to get rid of that? No. Even the notion I need to get rid of it is putting you back in the story again. So it's not, I was hitting on that briefly about, there's this thing going around about when I get rid of all the conditioning. That's completely false. It is not how this works. It's never how it works. Nobody in this room has any conditioning in terms of who they are. Their being doesn't have any conditioning. I was talking to someone last night, but basically the notion that I have conditioning, that concept, creates the conditioning, creates the belief or the notion that there even is such a thing. Without that concept, what do you have? So people are going around saying, I've got conditioning about conditioning. The very concept itself is the problem. Because if you pause that thought, it's just pure being. And a thought or two going through that's it's not like a cloud, it's not sticking in the sky, it's just going through and nothing's changing. So this notion that I am here and I've got all this stuff is part of the construct. And then people are trying to keep that and then fix that and get all the conditioning to go away. Then they think, then I'll be there. But what if you just drop the concept and see where I actually am, and you are there? That's how it was pointed out to me, and I never got rid of it. That's why I never had an awakening. I never had an enlightenment. I never embodied anything. I never got rid of any conditioning. I never answered the Vedanta questions. I never did anything. I think I realized I didn't need it. Now, it sounds kind of weird, but I wouldn't have thought that. But it turned out that I didn't need to do any of that. And yet still, the sense of seeking and feeling limited and suffering did settle down and resolve. Because, let's say the notion of seeking, well, how far am I away from my being? Well, I'm not far away from it at all. There goes the seeking. Getting established in it and abiding in it, living at it. Well, am I a separate entity that has to have that agenda? Well, I can't even prove that that's even true. So there goes the embodiment and the stabilizing and the getting it and all that. And, and then somebody, it's like, somehow this was all pointed out and there was no awakening at all. And yet I still, kind of know that. I recognize kind of what I am. And it's like, well, everybody can see who they are and be what they are with no special exotic experience. Well, there went the awakening, the enlightenment stuff. And I mean, maybe in some tradition somebody used it as a metaphor to point to this. It became a pointer, and that's fine. But, as usual, we probably misinterpret the pointer, and then we think, well, I guess I'm not there yet. But everybody is there. They go back to, it's what you are. And nobody needs to see anything more than that. Yeah.
I believe I get what you're saying, that being is what it's all about. But the fact is that I will go out of here, as I have in many other meetings, and go back to a life of suffering. And my interest is how to end the suffering.
Well, let me ask you a Byron Katie style question. Are you absolutely sure that will happen?
That's what's happened in the past.
Yeah, but you don't actually know. You could walk out and it's like, wait a minute, it doesn't stick anymore. You become the Teflon guy. Who knows? That's actually what happened for me, actually. The suffering completely ended and I didn't even realize it. And I was sitting there in a meeting like this, kind of saying, what's going to happen when I do this, and what's going to happen when that comes up, and what's going to happen to that. It turned out it was all unnecessary, because when I walked out of the meeting, the basic truth of what we're talking about, it was seen, because it's not difficult to see it. And what I did find, actually, was later when these old patterns and thoughts and stuff kind of came up, much to my surprise, I didn't believe it anymore. And because I didn't believe it anymore, and because I wasn't identifying as that's my nature, this engagement and identification, involvement, the psychological suffering wasn't my experience anymore. And I didn't even have to alter the content. It's not about changing the appearance of it. Your mind can say all day long that you're unenlightened, you're no good. The only trick is if you take it as who you are. If you realize that's not what I am, and you don't identify with that, it's completely innocuous. It has no hook on it. Oh, that's interesting. And literally that was coming up for me all the time. These things would come up. You're not there yet. You're not enlightened yet. It's not good enough. And I just look at those things. That's an interesting idea, because I used to believe that. And I would sit there and I would just watch this stuff come through. And it's like it just kind of like just roll off your shoulders. So what I would say, my view of you, is that you are present and aware, and you have a nature that you can't escape, and that it really is what non-duality is about, and you are that. That's, to me, the message. When you walk out of the room, it won't change.
So there is no suffering.
Well, suffering being this taking our being to be something that it's not, or exchanging it for a concept, or taking myself to be a separate self. That is necessary for suffering. It's necessary for seeking. That's necessary for feeling incomplete. That's necessary for having a problem. Because the being, your natural state, doesn't have any of those problems. It's not a limited person separate from anything. It's not good, it's not bad, it's not unenlightened, it's not anything like that. So that is one of the pointers. I'm not saying you would necessarily just hear me and somehow agree with me, but I think that my view, or my experience of this, is if you actually look into the nature of what you are, you'll find that naturally it's free of suffering. It doesn't have any of those problems. That's what we've always been that. And that's the possibility, or that's the pointer to say, hey, because it's not like, and it's possible because it works. It's worked for many, many people. And so the most truest thing that I could say about you that I know for sure, independently of what may or may not happen, is that you will leave the meeting present and aware beyond any doubt, and you can't escape that. And whatever else you experience, whatever it might be, will come and go, and will not be who you are in the deepest sense. And from my perspective, if that's all that you see, that's all you need to see. Because, to take this changing content to be what I am and say that's me, that's the suffering. Without that activity, it's just like what's here right now without a concept, without any self-definition. What is the nature of just pure being? And it's useful to explore that. Because one of the age-old pointers, it's not just present and aware, but they say ananda or peace or whatever. And we see that too when we see that not only is this being here, which I've overlooked, and it's aware and I am that, but that it doesn't have that suffering or that problem, and that's why they try to describe it as wholeness or peace or something like that. And that will still be there when it's now when you leave it. That's how I would see it.
John, when you get into a situation like your illness, does the suffering come up for a little and you just don't take delivery, or you just not take delivery of the concepts the way Bob talks about it?
Well, my view is if you take it right down to the root and be very clear and emphatic on that you're not the separate I, period, that it's pretty much it. Because all the mind can ever do is say, you're this, you're this, you're this, you're this. Let's say that you're dying, physically. There is no psychological suffering in that experience by necessarily in that. I mean, animals die all the time. Trees, bugs, everybody. Even older people, they die in peace. So even the psychological suffering in the illness or the death is not due to the mere experience. It's due to the I'm dying.
And does that mean
But if I'm not the I, then and through looking and realizing beyond any doubt that conceptual I is not what I am, then no matter what the mind says about the I, it still doesn't have a foothold.
But if you think it's around at a horrific time and you're still buying into the identity some, you just investigate that I some more to find out if it's real?
Sure. I mean, I would still say that, I would say my only advice is to look at these basic points and verify them to your satisfaction to see if you can see the truth of them. And then all these kinds of questions, they kind of take care of themselves.
Because there is no I right now if I'm present and aware. There is no I.
Okay.
But there's a huge temptation to buy into the thoughts when the shit hits the fan. There's a real temptation. Oh, that thought comes, then another thought comes.
Well, only because they're about the I.
Yeah.
So don't fudge on this no I thing. Be true and be thorough on that. Because if there is no I, that means all those thoughts that cause suffering, that is a key point about this, I didn't go over it, but that those suffering thoughts are about the me. Suffering.
That's just a concept when I'm really suffering.
Well, but it's important to realize that every limiting thought that causes that suffering, seeking, and doubt is a description of the I thought. And we can only suffer if there is some interest or identity as that person. So if you see it very, very clearly that thought is not what you are, it is a concept. Then the mind comes up and says, you're this, you're that, you're whatever. It just doesn't work anymore. It's over.
And there is a tendency to say, yeah, I should be suffering right now and I'm not. Can I really believe it?
Yeah, but that's another self-centered story.
some music?
Sure.
Yeah,
How
and
we
then
do? It's
need-
getting late anyway.
Yeah, we need
How about one song
one
too?
song, then we need to stay on schedule because we may have some different people as they
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, let me do a quick one and.
Yeah, come on.
Well, great questions. I really enjoy your participation and your engagement. It's a good group.
Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah, glad I made it out.
How many people, John, attend your Thursday night in California? I was curious.
5 maybe.
Isn't that something?
And I live in the heart of South Song land. But there's not that many people interested in knowing who they are in this kind of sense. Because
Is that right?
the spiritual search is very attractive.
There's so many books. I think that
Yeah.
are just flocking to these events.
Yeah, well, they do flock to the events that talk about the person and stuff to do and how to get enlightened and all. Those get packed.
Yeah.
But the ones that say that there's no teacher and you don't need anything and there's no person, those tend not to get.
Graduate your students too quickly.
Yeah, well, I always say to people, this is a bad business model. Because basically you say, you don't need the teacher, you don't need anything, and especially if you're consistent, you don't have to do it's my opinion, but you're not doing big retreats and big products, and because all that's irrelevant to this. Nobody needs to go to retreat. You can see everything that you need to see easily in a meeting like this. So why do all that stuff? So it's kind of a bad business venture. So
Kind of like stand-up.
it's kind of like Rodney, what's his name?
Dangerfield.
Rodney Dangerfield. No respect, but there are many. It's very easy. There are many temptations, and it would be very easy to compromise this. And I just. I don't advise, suddenly going out and saying, now I've got it, now I'm enlightened, and now this, and turning it into a marketing venture. And people do that, and they come to grief because it goes right back into the special me again. And I just don't think that that's the best approach. But I used to know a guy that said, "Well, I'm enlightened, I don't have a self anymore, and I've achieved it." And there was so many contradictions in that. And it was not true, believe me. Somebody said that knew him behind said, "This guy is the most self-centered, selfish person I've ever met." And yet his whole claim to fame was that he didn't exist anymore. So I don't know. Well, here's one I wrote recently. It's kind of a ballad. Always with you. So the point is, whatever is always always present. I have to use the U word. Sorry, but whatever is always with us is what this is about. So. Start with the fact of your being. What else could be so clear? Even to doubt your existence only confirms it's here. That which is true is always with you. That which is true is always notice the light of awareness. See how it shines alone. All other things come into being only when they that which is true is always with you. That which is true is always with you. All space and time appears in the heart. At last you will find it was here from the start. That which is true is always with you. See how you must be present for anything else to be. You are that pure, unchanging essence, peaceful and ever free. That which is true is always with you. That which is true is always with you. All space and time appears in the heart. At last you will find it was here from the start. That which is true is always with you. With you, always with you. That was a phrase that Sarah Bob told me. She said, "Start with the fact of your being." And just going through different things about that. I think one of my favorite things here, and this is, at last you will find it was here from the start. Like when we began that search, what am I, what is it, where is it, and all that stuff, what we didn't quite see, and we will come to see when we look at this, is it was actually fully present. And actually undeniably present, and it was almost kind of self-evident the whole time. That's kind of a interesting thing that you discover about that. You know, this also talks about, you know, that being. I was kind of trying to get expansive with that there, but all of the space and all of the time and all of this appearance, including that body, this body, and everything is in that awareness, is in that conscious presence, actually. There's just pointers to kind of try to open it up a little bit. All right, well, I think we've... Thank you. All right.
Let Tanya